Now let's discuss subrecipient monitoring. 2 CFR 200-331. Just as federal awarding agencies monitor prime recipients, recipients with subrecipients must monitor the subrecipient's performance to ensure that performance goals are achieved. Pass-through entities are required to monitor the activities of the subrecipient to ensure that the subaward is used for authorized purposes, in compliance with federal statutes, regulations, and terms and conditions of the subaward. Reviewing financial and performance reports is required by the pass-through entity. Following up and ensuring that the subrecipient takes timely and appropriate actions on all deficiencies pertaining to the federal award regarding audits, on-site reviews, and other means is necessary. And issuing a management decision on audit findings pertaining to the federal award provided to the subrecipient from the pass-through entity. See 2 CFR 200-521 management decision may be needed. Corrective actions toward subrecipients include transmission of the finding to the subrecipient, acceptance of the finding by the subrecipient, submission of a corrective action plan to the steps to be taken, performance metrics to measure progress, and a schedule for implementation. Use of a pass-through corrective action tracking system to monitor progress in implementing the corrective action plan. And use of a process to verify and validate that final corrective action is complete and effective. Now, sometimes it's difficult, and often the question comes up, is this firm going to be a subrecipient or should we consider them a contractor? 2 CFR 200-331 helps with the distinction. Subrecipients determine the individual's eligibility for assistance, or they may help with that. The performance is measured in relation to established award objectives. The uses of award funds are to carry out a program for a public purpose and is responsible for programmatic decision-making, in addition to being required to adhere to federal program requirements defined in the award. Whereas with contractors, they provide similar goods and services within normal business operations to many different purchasers. They normally operate in a competitive environment. They provide goods and services ancillary to the operation of the federal program, and they are not subject to compliance requirements of the federal program. Pass-through entity responsibilities outlined in 2 CFR 200-332 include that they should have a process in place to handle identification of deficiencies in day-to-day management, for instance, excess cash on hand. Should have a process for formal monitoring, desk reviews, site visits, and audits. If a subrecipient is not responsive, the awarding agency or pass-through entity should consider taking action against non-compliant subrecipients. 2 CFR 200-338 talks about remedies for non-compliance. Fixed amount subawards are described in 2 CFR 333. Fixed amount awards means a type of grant or cooperative agreement under which the federal awarding agency or pass-through entity provides a specific level of support without regard to actual costs incurred under the federal award. With prior written approval from the federal awarding agency, a pass-through entity may provide subawards based on fixed amounts up to the simplified acquisition threshold, provided that subawards meet the requirements for fixed amount awards as described in 2 CFR 200-201. Record retention and access are described in 2 CFR chapters 200-334 through 338. Recipients and subrecipients are expected to collect and maintain grant records for a specified period according to award documentation and federal guidance. Fundamental to keeping adequate grant records are programmatic records, financial records, supporting documents, statistical records, or all other entity records relevant to the federal award. Records management, what to keep in the grant file. The funding opportunity announcement, the submitted application, notice of award and all supporting documents, the scope of work and approved budget, all financial documents, including purchase orders, procurement transactions, contracts, and determinations for procurement methods, time and attendance records, payroll and fringe benefit calculations, subrecipient agreements, financial and progress reports, communications with the awarding agency, written pre-approvals, and evaluation results, including surveys, collections, analysis, and reporting, in addition to collaboration with stakeholders. In 2 CFR 200, 335, and 336, it talks about requests for transfer of records. In 2 CFR 200, 335, the federal awarding agency must request transfer of certain records to its custody from the non-federal entity when it determines that records possess long-term retention value. In 2 CFR 200, 336, it describes methods for collection, transmission, and storage of information. The federal awarding agency and the non-federal entity should, whenever practicable, collect, transmit, and store federal award-related information in open and machine-readable formats rather than in closed formats or on paper, in accordance with applicable legislative requirements. In 2 CFR 200, 337, and 338, records of non-federal entities are described in 2 CFR 200, 337. The federal awarding agency, inspectors general, the comptroller general of the United States, and the pass-through entity, or any of their other authorized representatives, must have the right of access to any documents, papers, or other records of the non-federal entity which are pertinent to the federal award in order to make audits, examinations, excerpts, and transcripts. Restrictions on public assets. Restrictions on public access to records, 2 CFR 200, 338, is as follows. Unless required by federal, state, and local and tribal statute, non-federal entities are not required to permit public access to their records. The non-federal entity's records provided to a federal agency generally will be subject to FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, and applicable exemptions. Remedies for noncompliance are described in 2 CFR 200, 339. If a non-federal entity fails to comply with the U.S. Constitution, federal statutes, regulations, or the terms and conditions of a federal award, the federal awarding agency or pass-through entity may impose additional conditions as described in 2 CFR 200, 208. If the federal awarding agency or pass-through entity determines that noncompliance cannot be remedied by imposing additional conditions, the federal awarding agency or pass-through entity may take one or more of the following actions as appropriate in the circumstances. It may temporarily withhold cash payments pending correction of the deficiency by the non-federal entity or more severe enforcement action by the federal awarding agency or pass-through entity. It can disallow, that is, deny both use of funds and any applicable matching credit for all or part of the cost of the activity or action not in compliance. It can wholly or partly suspend or terminate the federal award. It can initiate suspension or debarment proceedings as authorized under 2 CFR Part 180 and federal awarding agency regulations, or in the case of a pass-through entity, recommend such a proceeding be initiated by a federal awarding agency. It can withhold further federal awards for the project or program. It can also take other remedies that may be legally available. Termination by the federal awarding agency is described in 2 CFR 200, 340. An award can be terminated by the federal awarding agency if a non-federal entity fails to comply with the terms and conditions of a federal award. If an award no longer effectuates the program goals or agency priorities, with the consent of the non-federal entity, in which case the two parties must agree upon the termination conditions, including the effective date and, in the case of partial termination, the portion to be terminated. The federal awarding agency must report the termination to the OMB designated Integrity and Performance System, accessible through SAM. Currently, it's FAPIS. Termination by the non-federal entity also can include upon sending to the federal awarding agency or pass-through entity written notification setting forth the reasons for such termination, the effective date, and in the case of partial termination, the portion to be terminated. If the federal awarding agency or pass-through entity determines in the case of partial termination that the reduced or modified portion of the federal award or subaward will not accomplish the purposes for which the federal award was made, the federal awarding agency or pass-through entity may terminate the federal award in its entirety. This is describing termination by the non-federal entity. Notification of termination requirement is described in 2 CFR 200-341. The federal agency or pass-through entity must provide to the non-federal entity a notice of termination. Opportunities to object, hearings, and appeals described in Chapter 342. Section 342. The federal awarding agency must provide the non-federal entity an opportunity to object and provide information and documentation challenging the suspension or termination action. Section 343 describes effects of suspension and termination. Costs incurred as a result of the suspension or termination may or may not be considered allowable, depending on when the grant expires or were properly incurred prior. Closeout of the award, described in 2 CFR 200-344. The federal awarding agency or pass-through entity will close out the federal award when all applicable administrative actions and all required work has been completed by the non-federal entity. The recipient must submit no later than 120 calendar days after the end date of the period of performance, all financial, performance, and other reports as required by the terms and conditions of the federal award. A subrecipient must submit to the pass-through entity no later than 90 calendar days or an earlier date as agreed upon by the pass-through entity and subrecipient after the end date of the period of performance, all financial, performance, and other reports as required by the terms and conditions of the federal award. Post-closeout adjustments are described in 2 CFR 200-345. According to 2 CFR 200-345, the closeout of a federal award does not affect any of the following. 1, the right of the federal awarding agency or pass-through entity to disallow costs and recover funds based on a later audit or other review. The federal awarding agency or pass-through entity must make any cost disallowance determination and notify the non-federal entity within the record retention period. 2, the requirement for the non-federal entity to return any funds due as a result of later refunds, corrections, or other transactions, including final indirect cost rate adjustments. The ability of the federal awarding agency to make financial adjustments to a previously closed award, such as resolving indirect cost payments and making final payments. Audit requirements in subpart F of this part. Property management and disposition requirements as shown in 2 CFR 200-310 through 200-316 of this subpart. And record retention as required in 200-334 through 337 of this subpart. Collection of amounts due. 2 CFR 200-346 describes the fact that any funds paid to the non-federal entity in excess of the amount to which the non-federal entity is finally determined to be entitled under the terms of the federal award constitute a debt to the federal government. If not paid within 90 calendar days after demand, the federal awarding agency may reduce the debt by making an administrative offset against other requests for reimbursements, by withholding advance payments otherwise due to the non-federal entity, or other action permitted by federal statute, except where otherwise provided by statutes or regulations. The federal awarding agency will charge interest on an overdue debt in accordance with the federal claims collection standards, as described in 31 CFR Parts 900 through 999. The date from which interest is computed is not extended by litigation or filing of any form or appeal. In closing, I'll go over the governance laws that are pertinent to post-award. The Bayh-Dole Act, which talked about inventions, the Cash Management Improvement Act, the Electronic Fund Transfer Act, the Federal Financial Assistance Management Improvement Act, the Government Performance and Results Act or Modernization Act, GIPRA or GPRMA, the Improper Payments Elimination and Recovery Act or Improvement Act, Overall Dispersing Rules for all federal agencies, Program Management Improvement Accountability Act, Recovery Audits Act, and the Uniform Guidance. Key terms for post-award: accounting, accrual basis accounting, advance payment, base costs, base period for the allocation of indirect costs, benchmarking, cash basis accounting, cash disbursement, cash on hand, cash receipts, cognizant agency for indirect costs, compliance, cost sharing, disposition, duration, evaluation framework, exempt federally owned property, expenditure, Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board, FASAB, federal share of expenditures, federal share of unliquidated obligations, final rate, FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board, fixed rate, generally accepted accounting principles or GAAP, good accounting systems, grants officers, improper payments, indicator, indirect cost pool, indirect cost rate of proposal, iteration, micro purchase, obligations, outcome, output, performance management, performance objective, predetermined rate, procurement by non-competitive means, procurement by sealed bids, program or program fidelity, program income, additive or deductive, program officers, project, provisional rate, quality assurance, quality control, quality system, recipient share of expenditures, remaining recipient share to be provided, small purchase procedures, supplies, time and materials type contract, total federal funds awarded, authorized, total federal program income earned, total recipient share required, unexpended program income, unobligated balance, value engineering, and work plan. I hope that this was very helpful, and it's been a pleasure to serve.